Time for me does not exist as anything like a line on which you can arrange things. I would say that time is, the expression is emergent. What for me really exists is myself and you and things, the chair I'm sitting on. But I don't think there is any time like a substance, like any fluid or anything like that. We would never have the idea that time is passing unless we were aware of change. So ever since then, I've been convinced that the primary thing is change, or if you like, even difference. The only evidence for the past is the consistency of our records, consistency of our memory, and the fact that we actually see movement. I think that's all it is. But the main thing I have from this is enjoy the moment, carpe diem, to make the most of every moment of your life as best you can.
Human trust in our own senses is absolute and rarely examined. The eyes show the sun crossing the sky, and for thousands of years, that was proof enough that the earth stood still. The senses present evidence. The mind accepts it. And on top of that acceptance, entire civilizations build their certainties. The problem isn't perceiving things wrong. It's confusing perception with reality. What feels like unquestionable truth may just be the limit of the biological apparatus. There's a sensation so constant, so universal, so absolutely convincing that no one thinks to question it: the passage of time. Every human being experiences seconds slipping away and assumes that this experience reveals something about the universe. Maybe it only reveals something about the brain that produces it.
Modern physics holds a secret that few are willing to discuss openly. A secret with implications so profound that the scientific community itself prefers to keep it within academic circles, far from public debate. And this secret concerns the nature of time. What most people understand as time, this linear progression from the past to the future, this constant flow that seems to carry existence along with it, may not exist. As a fundamental physical reality, time may simply not be real. But before examining this possibility, we need to understand how we got here. How did humanity build such a flawed understanding of something so basic? Isaac Newton, in the 17th century, observed the universe and identified patterns. Celestial bodies moved with mathematical regularity. Apples fell, planets orbited, everything seemed to obey precise laws. And Newton, in an attempt to systematize these observations, made a choice that would determine Western thought for the next 300 years. He postulated the existence of an absolute time. In Newton's own words, this time flows uniformly, without relation to anything external. An invisible cosmic clock, keeping the rhythm of the entire universe. Each second identical to the one before. Each moment follows the next in a perfect and universal cadence. The problem with this formulation? Newton was describing what his senses perceived, not what reality actually presents. He codified a subjective experience as an objective law, and this methodological error contaminated physics for centuries. Einstein's relativity began to dismantle this structure in the early 20th century. Experiments demonstrated, with measurable precision, that time is not absolute. Clocks in motion tick differently from clocks at rest. Clocks near intense gravitational masses age more slowly than clocks far away. The GPS in our smartphones only works because engineers correct for these time differences between satellites and the Earth's surface. But Einstein, despite being revolutionary, didn't go far enough. He demonstrated that time is relative, malleable, and elastic. The British physicist Julian Barbour spent decades taking this logic to the conclusion that few dared to reach. If time is so malleable, so dependent on perspective, so different from what intuition suggests, why assume it exists as a fundamental dimension? In The End of Time, published in 1999, Barbour presents a thesis that traditional academia finds disturbing. Time, he argues, is just another spatial dimension. The fourth dimension of Einsteinian spacetime isn't a flow, it's a direction. static, geometric, as motionless as height, width, and depth. No one says that width flows. No one experiences depth as something that passes. These are simply directions in space. Barbour proposes that time works the same way, and that the sensation of flow is an artifact of consciousness, not a property of the cosmos. The analogy he uses is instructive. Consider a roll of movie film unspooled on a table. All the frames exist simultaneously, the first, the last, and the ones in between, all present at the same instant. When the film is projected, the illusion of movement appears, but this illusion is in the projector and the observer, not in the film. The human brain, according to this model, works like a projector. It processes reality, frame by frame, creating the subjective experience of temporal sequence. But this sequence isn't out there in the universe, it's in here, in the neurological apparatus that evolved to organize information in ways useful for survival. The uncomfortable question arises naturally: is there any mathematical proof of this? There is, and it comes from one of the most fundamental equations in theoretical physics. The Wheeler-DeWitt equation describes the quantum behavior of the universe as a whole. It represents the attempt to unify quantum mechanics with general relativity. And this equation, developed by John Wheeler and Bryce DeWitt in the 1960s, has a characteristic that should have provoked an existential crisis in physics. It doesn't contain the variable t. Time is absent from the equation that describes the cosmos at its most fundamental level. The math works perfectly without it. The predictions remain valid. The universe, described in its deepest equations, simply doesn't need time to exist. Why isn't this widely discussed? Why have most people never heard of the Wheeler-DeWitt equation or the implications of Barbour's work? Perhaps because these implications are too uncomfortable. Perhaps because accepting that time doesn't exist forces a complete revision of how humanity understands reality, mortality, and purpose. Newton saw a universal clock. Einstein demonstrated that the clock was malleable. Barbour realized there was never any clock at all. So what exists then? What's left when time is removed from the equation? The answer to this question requires examining a structure that physics has known about for decades, but rarely explains to the public, a structure called the block universe, and its implications are even more disturbing than the simple absence of time. Theoretical physics has been working for decades with a model of reality that remains virtually unknown outside specialized circles. This model emerges directly from the equations of general relativity and was taken to its ultimate consequences by Julian Barbour in The End of Time. The technical name is the block universe. The model proposes something specific. The entire universe can be visualized as a complete four-dimensional structure. Imagine a block of transparent crystal. Inside this crystal, every event that has ever happened and every event that will ever happen occupies a fixed position. The Big Bang at one end, the final destiny of the cosmos at the other. And between these 2 points, the entire history of the universe, every second, every moment, every configuration of matter and energy exists as permanent data. There is no privileged now in this structure. There is no present that moves through the block, illuminating successive moments. The year 1850 is just as present as 2025. The difference lies only in the position within the geometry, not in the degree of reality. Barbour develops this idea rigorously. He argues that the sensation of now, this experience that the present moment is special, unique, the only moment that truly exists, is a product of consciousness, not a characteristic of the universe. Each point in the block universe contains observers who experience that point as now. An inhabitant of the year 1850 experiences 1850 as the present with the same intensity and certainty with which you experience this moment. Neither one is wrong. Both nows exist. The structure contains all of them. This means something disturbing about the past. Every moment you've lived, your childhood, your relationships, the people you loved, the experiences that shaped who you are, hasn't disappeared. These moments continue to exist at specific coordinates in the space-time block. The sensation of loss, that the past is gone, reflects a perceptual limitation, not a physical reality. Barbour uses a precise analogy. When you travel from one city to another, the city you left behind doesn't cease to exist. It remains. You've simply changed location. The same principle applies to time in the block universe. The inability to return to these moments is a restriction of your trajectory through the block, not evidence that they've stopped being real. And what about the future? If the block universe is a complete structure, then future events already occupy defined coordinates in the geometry of the cosmos. This doesn't mean you know the future. It means it's there, as concrete as the past, as real as the present. The question of free will arises naturally from this structure. If the future already exists, are the choices you believe you're making genuine? Or are they just the subjective experience of traveling along a predetermined trajectory? Barbour addresses this directly. He distinguishes between the experience of choosing and the structure of reality. The experience is real. You genuinely feel that you're weighing options and deciding. But this experience occurs within a geometry that already contains all configurations. The choice exists as an event in the block. The process of choosing, with all its psychological nuances, is part of the structure. But the structure itself doesn't change as a result of the choice. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics complicate this picture. The idea of multiple universes suggests that each quantum possibility generates a branch, multiple blocks coexisting, each containing a different version of events. But even in this scenario, each individual block remains determined. Quantum indeterminacy may select which block conscious experience unfolds in, but it doesn't alter the fixed nature of each specific block. The central point remains intact. Eternity, in the context of the block universe, doesn't refer to infinite duration. It refers to the absence of time as flow. The block doesn't last, it simply is. Asking how long it has existed applies a temporal category to something that is outside of time. The question doesn't make sense. Contemplative traditions from various cultures have described similar intuitions for millennia. The notion that time is illusory, that past, present, and future coexist in a broader reality. That eternity isn't in the distant future, but is present here and now, accessible to those who can perceive beyond the temporal veil. Physics arrived at structurally identical conclusions through completely independent paths. Mathematical equations, not meditation. Experiments, not revelation. And yet, the destination described is the same: a cosmos where nothing is lost, where everything remains, where the death of the moment is an illusion of perspective. Julian Barbour spent decades developing these ideas to a point that even the traditional block universe doesn't reach. He proposes eliminating time completely, not just as flow, but as a mathematical variable. A physics without time. A universe composed only of instantaneous configurations, each one complete in itself, each one eternal. This proposal has a name: the theory of nows, and it reformulates not only physics, but the very nature of what it means to exist. Julian Barbour lives on a farm on the outskirts of Oxford. He holds no university position. He never wanted one. For decades, he financed his own research by translating scientific texts from Russian, while developing a theory that most of his colleagues considered too radical to take seriously. Barbour proposes with mathematical rigor that physics must be completely rewritten. and that this rewriting requires the elimination of time as a fundamental variable. Not the relativization of time, not the demonstration that time is malleable, total elimination. A physics where the letter T simply doesn't appear in the equations. How is this possible? Barbour starts from a technical observation that few outside theoretical physics know about. The most fundamental equations of quantum cosmology, particularly the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, already work without time. This isn't a discovery by Barbour. It's a fact that's been known since the 1960s. What Barbour did was take this fact seriously and ask, if the most fundamental equation of the universe doesn't need time, why do we insist on putting it in other equations? The answer, according to him, is habit, convenience, the inability to imagine reality any other way. But reality, Barbour argues, doesn't care about our ability to imagine it. In The End of Time, he develops an alternative model. The universe isn't a sequence of states evolving through time. The universe is a collection of configurations, complete three-dimensional snapshots that Barbour calls nows. Each now is a specific arrangement of all the matter and energy of the cosmos at a given instant. There is no before or after connecting these nows. They simply exist, like pages of a book that was never bound, loose, scattered, each one complete in itself. Barbour uses the image of a deck of cards thrown on a table. Each card represents a now, an instantaneous configuration of the universe. Some cards are very similar to each other. They differ only in minimal details. Others are radically different. All of them coexist on the table. What we call time is the relationship of similarity between the cards. When you look at a sequence of very similar cards, arranged in a specific order, your brain interprets this as change, as movement, as temporal flow. But this flow isn't in the cards, it's in the interpretation. The cards don't transform into each other, they simply exist, each one eternally fixed in what it is. Here's the point that distinguishes Barbour from other physicists who work with the block universe. For most of them, time still exists as a dimension. It just doesn't flow. For Barbour, even this is too much of a concession. Time isn't a static dimension. Time is nothing. Only the relationship between configurations exists. If you shuffle the cards, the universe contains exactly the same information. The order doesn't matter because there is no intrinsic order. Only the complete collection of all possible nows exists, what Barbour calls Platonia, in reference to Plato's world of forms. The practical implications of this structure are vast. Consider aging. Common experience suggests that the body degrades over time, that youth is left behind, that death approaches. But in Barbour's model, this narrative is an illusion of perspective. What really happens? Consciousness navigates through nows that contain progressively different biological configurations. There is no degradation happening. There are multiple nows, each with a specific bodily configuration. Some contain young bodies, others contain old bodies. Consciousness traces a trajectory through these nows, and this trajectory creates the experience of aging. But the nows with young bodies don't disappear, they remain, as real as they always were. This eliminates what physicists call the arrow of time, the apparent direction from past to future. In Platonia, there is no arrow, there is no privileged direction. Consciousness could, theoretically, navigate in any direction. The fact that our experience follows a specific trajectory, from birth to death, from order to disorder, is a characteristic of the trajectory, not of the territory. Why does the trajectory follow this particular direction? Barbour connects this to questions of probability and the structure of Platonia. There are many more high-entropy configurations than low-entropy ones. The trajectory statistically tends toward more probable regions. But tends here doesn't mean movement. It means that most possible trajectories pass through these regions. Orthodox physics resisted these ideas for decades, Barbour worked in relative isolation, publishing in specialized journals, presenting at conferences where his proposals were received with skepticism. The implications are too disturbing. If Barbour is correct, then the Newtonian physics that still governs engineering, technology, and everyday life is fundamentally wrong. It works as a useful approximation, but it describes a reality that doesn't exist. And even more disturbing, if time doesn't exist, then concepts like destiny, eternity, and immortality cease to be philosophical speculations. They become technical descriptions of the structure of the cosmos. This opens doors that institutional science prefers to keep closed. Doors that connect cutting-edge physics with territories traditionally reserved for spirituality. Doors that, once opened, completely change the understanding of what it means to live and what it means to die.
The human mind has developed a peculiar dependency, the sensation of building the next moment. This illusion of temporal agency functions as a psychological anchor. It offers purpose. It offers direction. The idea that the future already exists, complete, defined, provokes something close to existential panic. Not because it's sad, but because it removes the role of architect that the ego has claimed for itself. If the structure is already complete, what's left to do? The question reveals the fundamental misunderstanding. Navigating an eternal structure is no less meaningful than supposedly building it, but it requires a shift in identity that few are willing to make. It's more comfortable to believe yourself the creator of an uncertain future than the navigator of an eternity that's already present.
If the future already exists, if it occupies real coordinates in the geometry of space-time, then an uncomfortable question needs to be asked. Why can't we see it? The conventional answer is simple, because the future hasn't happened yet. There's nothing to see. Anyone who claims to have seen events before they occurred is lying, hallucinating, or interpreting coincidences as patterns. This position makes complete sense within the Newtonian model, where time flows and the future is built moment by moment. But this model faces problems that theoretical physics has documented for decades. In the block universe described in The End of Time, the future isn't being built, it's already built. Tomorrow's events, next year's events, next decade's events exist now. According to this model, the information is there, complete, accessible, in principle. The question then reformulates itself. It's no longer, why can't we see the future? It becomes, what prevents us from accessing information that already exists? The answer, within this framework, lies in consciousness, or more precisely, in the way consciousness operates. The brain creates the experience of a now that moves through time. Memory retrieves data from the past. Perception registers the present. Projection imagines future possibilities. This linear processing is so automatic, so constant, that it seems to be the very nature of reality. But according to Barbour, this is an interface, a mode of operation, and modes of operation can be altered. Here, theoretical physics encounters something that anthropologists have documented for centuries. Every known human culture has developed practices for inducing altered states of consciousness: meditation, prolonged fasting, sensory deprivation, rhythmic breathing, specific substances, rites of passage involving extreme physical stress. The diversity of techniques contrasts with the uniformity of reported results, modified temporal perception, access to inexplicable information, and visions of events that haven't yet occurred. Materialist science dismisses these reports as neurological dysfunction. The brain under stress produces aberrant experiences. End of story. But this explanation ignores an obvious problem. If these experiences were just neural noise with no informational value, why would entire societies, for millennia, organize critical decisions around them? Wars were declared or avoided based on oracular visions. Harvests were planned according to prophecies. Leaders were chosen or deposed based on the interpretation of dreams. These societies couldn't afford to waste resources on useless superstitions. If the practice persisted for so long, it was producing some kind of result. Barbour's model offers an architecture that would explain how this might work. In the structure of nows, all instants coexist. Consciousness normally navigates this landscape in a restricted way, experiencing one now at a time. But this restriction wouldn't be a fundamental physical law. It would be a characteristic of ordinary brain processing. Under certain conditions, extreme stress, near death, deep meditation, this processing can be altered, and when it's altered, consciousness would momentarily access information from nows that, in the normal linear sequence, would be classified as future. Physics has a technical term for this type of phenomenon: retrocausality. Information connecting what we call the future to what we call the past. In conventional physics, this seems to violate causality. But conventional causality depends on the time that flows. If time doesn't flow, if past and future are different regions of a static structure, then there would be no violation. There would just be a connection between parts of a whole that was always complete. Consider a déjà vu, that disturbing experience of recognizing a moment that's happening for the first time. The standard explanation involves memory glitches, the brain mistakenly classifying present perception as past memory. But within Barbour's framework, there's another possibility: information leakage. Consciousness briefly accesses data from a future, now and then experiences that now as present, with the residual feeling of already knowing it. Premonitions would work through the same mechanism on an amplified scale. The usual mode of temporal operation would become momentarily permeable. Information from future configurations would reach present consciousness. The person sees what hasn't happened yet, except that in the structure proposed by Barbour, it has happened. It always happened. The future wouldn't be forming. It would be waiting. Ancient cultures didn't have access to theoretical physics, but they had something equally valuable: thousands of years of empirical experimentation with states of consciousness. Shamans, oracles, and prophets, all working with similar phenomena, developing techniques to induce exactly this controlled permeability. They called it vision, revelation, divine gift. The 21st century physical model offers a different description: non-linear access to information distributed across a static, four-dimensional structure. The names are different. The phenomenon described is structurally equivalent. Materialist science rejected the possibility of premonition because its model of time didn't allow for any explanatory mechanism. Without a mechanism, no valid phenomenon. That was the operating logic. But Barbour's architecture provides exactly the structure by which information from the future could, in principle, reach the present. This doesn't automatically validate every reported premonition. Many remain coincidence, confirmation bias, and selective memory. But it means that dismissing the entire phenomenon as physically impossible no longer holds up in the same way. The theoretical structure exists. The mechanism is described. According to this model, the future already exists. The information about it already exists. The question stops being whether this information can be accessed. It becomes, under what conditions does access become possible? Cultures around the world spent millennia mapping these conditions. The question that remains is direct. Why does institutional science resist so strongly, even considering this possibility? The resistance of institutional science to Julian Barbour's ideas isn't accidental. It's not ordinary academic conservatism. There's something deeper at work, something that touches the foundations of what science believes itself to be and the role it occupies in society. To understand this resistance, you first need to understand what's at stake. Accepting that time doesn't exist would trigger a cascade of consequences that institutional science doesn't want to absorb. Every scientific discipline depends on time as a fundamental variable. Biology is the study of how organisms evolve through time. Psychology examines how the mind develops over time. Economics models how systems change with time. Medicine deals with how bodies degrade over time. Remove time from these equations, and the entire edifice needs to be rebuilt. The conceptual framework, the story that science tells about what it's doing, changes radically. And institutions don't like radical changes, especially when those changes threaten the relevance of entire careers, established funding lines, and consolidated hierarchies. But there's an even deeper layer of resistance. If the future already exists, science faces a problem of purpose. The modern scientific project is grounded in a specific premise. The future is uncertain, but it can be controlled. Science studies the laws of nature to predict future events and modify them. That's the promise. It's what justifies funding, institutional prestige, and the privileged position that science occupies in contemporary society. If the future is already built into the geometry of space-time, this promise collapses. Science can still describe patterns. It can still identify regularities. But the idea of controlling the future loses meaning when the future already exists as a physical reality. This is fatalism. And fatalism is precisely what modern science was built to combat. The scientific revolution was born in opposition to worldviews where destiny was sealed, where forces determined events, and where humanity was powerless before an indifferent cosmos. Science promised something else: agency, control, the capacity to shape the future through knowledge. Barbour's theory, presented in The End of Time, puts this promise in check. Choices exist as part of the structure, but the structure is already complete. The future isn't being built by present decisions. Present decisions and their future results coexist eternally. For an institution whose legitimacy depends on the promise of control over the future, this message is unacceptable. Broadcasting it would be institutional suicide. There's yet another factor, one that operates less visibly, but possibly more powerfully. Institutional science maintains a complex relationship with religion. For centuries, these two forms of knowledge have disputed territory. Science gradually conquered domains that once belonged to theology: the origin of the universe, the diversity of life, and the nature of the mind. Each conquest reinforced an implicit narrative. Science deals with facts, religion deals with beliefs. Science progresses, religion stagnates. This narrative depends on maintaining a clear separation between the two domains. And here's the problem. The implications of the block universe converge uncomfortably with traditionally religious concepts. If the past continues to exist, nothing is ever lost. If the future already exists, there is something like destiny. If all moments are eternally present, eternity isn't a theological promise, it's a physical description. Eternal life ceases to be an article of faith and becomes a structural consequence of the cosmos. Decades of work building a separation between science and religion, and suddenly cutting-edge physics describes a universe that resembles the mystical descriptions that spiritual traditions have taught for millennia: eternity, permanence, the illusion of time, the unchanging underlying reality. This convergence isn't celebrated in academic halls, it's feared. Julian Barbour experienced this resistance personally. In The End of Time, he recounts decades of work in relative isolation, publications in specialized journals, presentations at conferences where his ideas were received with skepticism because the implications are too disturbing. There's also a question of convenience. Newtonian physics, which Barbour demonstrates is fundamentally wrong about the nature of time, still works for engineering purposes. Bridges are built with Newtonian physics. Airplanes fly with Newtonian physics. For everyday applications, the old model serves. This creates a division. Theoretical physicists know that Newtonian time is a crude approximation. They know that the most fundamental equations work without it. But why disturb the public with this information? Why create existential crises when the old model continues to serve practical needs? This attitude, deciding that certain information is too disturbing for wide dissemination, keeps Barbour's work confined to specialized circles. Entropy offers another point of resistance. Mainstream physics is comfortable with the idea of degradation. Systems tend toward disorder. The universe is heading toward heat death. This is a familiar narrative. Everything ends, everything falls apart. The cosmos is indifferent and terminal. The block universe contradicts this narrative. Nothing falls apart because nothing is moving through time. Degradation is a characteristic of certain trajectories through the structure, not a property of the structure itself. The cosmos, in this model, is eternal, complete, permanent. Institutional science prefers a universe that's dying to a universe that's eternal. It prefers entropy to permanence. It prefers chance to structure. Because these preferences maintain the separation between science and spirituality. They keep the territories demarcated. They keep the narrative of progress and control intact. The price of this preference is ignoring what the equations themselves indicate, marginalizing thinkers like Barbour, depriving the public of information that would transform the understanding of life, death, and what it means to exist. And the most uncomfortable question of all, if theoretical physics points to eternity, to the permanence of all moments, to the illusion of death, why does this information remain hidden? Who benefits from this silence?
There's a phenomenon that's rarely examined: the human attachment to one's own finitude. The idea that everything ends, that death is total annihilation, should be terrifying. And yet, many defend it fiercely. Physics points to eternity, and the reaction isn't relief, it's resistance. The mechanism is revealing. Finitude gives weight to choices, urgency to days, meaning to what would otherwise be mere passage. If nothing truly ends, where's the drama? The ego has structured its identity around the narrative of the struggle against time. Remove the adversary and the identity collapses. Eternity isn't frightening because it's empty. It's frightening because it makes irrelevant the story that each person insists on telling about themselves.
Everything presented up to this point converges on a single question. The question that defines the human experience more than any other. The question that lies behind every religion, every philosophy, and every existential anguish. What happens when we die? The conventional answer is brutal in its simplicity. Consciousness ceases. The body decomposes. The person stops existing. Everything they were, memories, personality, affections, disappears permanently. The universe continues, indifferent to the absence. This is the view that materialist science offers. Modern grief is shaped by it, the sensation that we lose people forever, that every death is a complete annihilation, that shared moments exist only as electrochemical traces in brains that will also die. But what happens to this view when the model of time changes? Julian Barbour, in The End of Time, constructs an architecture of the cosmos where this question receives a radically different answer. If the block universe is the real structure of reality, then the basic premise of annihilation through death doesn't hold up. The argument is direct. If the past continues to exist, then the moments where a person was alive haven't disappeared. Those moments remain. The space-time coordinates that contain them are just as real as the coordinates of the present. Death, in this model, isn't annihilation. It's a change of coordinates. Consider the implication. The moments of a person's life continue to exist permanently in the space-time block. Birth occupies a coordinate, childhood occupies others, relationships, achievements, and experiences. Each of these moments exists at specific positions in cosmic geometry. Death marks the end of a trajectory through these coordinates. It doesn't mark the end of the existence of these coordinates. The difference is fundamental. A trajectory that ends doesn't erase the points it passed through. A path that was traveled doesn't disappear just because the traveler reached the destination. The coordinates of life remain, eternally, regardless of whether any current consciousness is accessing them or not. Barbour develops this logic rigorously in his theory of nows. Each now is a complete configuration of the universe at an instant. Now doesn't flow, they don't change, they don't disappear, they simply are. A now containing a living person is just as real as a now containing that same person dead. Reality doesn't privilege one over the other. Both exist. The difference lies only in which now consciousness is accessing at a given moment. This completely reformulates the meaning of grief. The pain of loss, in the conventional model, is the pain of an absolute absence. The person is gone, no longer exists. It will never exist again. This interpretation carries an immense existential weight. In Barbour's model, the pain of loss takes on another contour. It's not the pain of absolute absence, it's the pain of inaccessibility. The person continues to exist at the coordinates where they always existed. The inability to access those coordinates from the current position doesn't mean they've stopped being real. The most precise analogy is geographical. When someone moves to another continent, the places they left behind don't disappear. They continue to exist. The person just can't access them from their new position. The same principle applies to time in the block universe. Death, in this structure, works as the horizon works for vision. The horizon seems to be the limit of the world. The line where the earth meets the sky seems to mark the end of existence. But this appearance is illusory. Beyond the horizon, there's more world, more earth, more reality. The horizon is a limit of perception, not a limit of existence. Death operates the same way. It seems to be the absolute end, the limit beyond which nothing exists. But according to Barbour's model, it's just the limit of what consciousness can access from its current position. Beyond that limit, the coordinates of existence remain, intact, real, eternal. Albert Einstein expressed this understanding directly. For us believing physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. This phrase isn't a metaphor. It's a technical description of what relativistic physics indicates about the nature of time. Mortality, in this understanding, isn't a definitive condemnation. It's a perceptual restriction. The biological body navigates a specific trajectory through the nows. This trajectory includes birth, development, aging, and death. But the trajectory doesn't define the limits of existence. It only defines the limits of a particular experience within the larger structure. Contemplative traditions from various cultures have taught variations of this understanding for millennia. The eternity of being, the illusion of death, permanence beyond time. Barbour's physics arrived at structurally equivalent conclusions through completely independent paths, mathematical equations, not mystical revelation. Two different methods. The same destination is described. If human consciousness normally operates as a mode that restricts access to one now at a time, then the practical question becomes, can this mode be modified? Can perception be expanded beyond the usual limits? The traditions that described eternity also developed techniques to access it. Meditation, contemplation, practices that alter the temporal processing of consciousness, not as an escape from reality, but as access to dimensions of reality that the ordinary mode blocks. Every profound transformation begins when you understand your real nature, not as a temporal being at the mercy of the clock, but as a navigator crossing an eternal structure. And the most direct way to expand this perception, to access the architecture that sustains all moments, is through conscious meditation. We've developed a set of audio tools designed to facilitate access to this expanded state of consciousness, where time stops being a prison and reveals itself as it always was, a navigable illusion. To learn more and get immediate access, click the link on the screen or in the comments. If this content resonated with something inside you, write in the comments, "It made sense to me."